November 14th, 1957. Joseph "Joe the Barber." Barbara stood on his 53-acre estate watching Cadillacs roll up his driveway like a presidential motorcade. Black sedans with license plates from New York, New Jersey, Florida, California, Texas, Pennsylvania, even Cuba. Inside each car sat men who controlled billions in illegal gambling, narcotics, and loan sharking across America and beyond. Vito Genovese had just murdered Albert Anastasia in a Manhattan barbershop 3 weeks earlier. Now he was summoning the Commission, the governing body of the American Mafia, to legitimize his coronation as the new boss of bosses. 100 mafiosi from the most powerful crime families on earth were descending on this sleepy hamlet along the Susquehanna River, 200 miles northwest of New York City. Barber's men had ordered 207 pounds of steak, 15 pounds of veal cutlets, and crates of wine from local suppliers. They'd reserved dozens of motel rooms across 3 counties. They made no effort at discretion because they believed rural cops couldn't possibly understand what they were witnessing. Why would they worry? FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover publicly denied that a national mafia even existed. These men had operated in complete invisibility for 26 years since Lucky Luciano formed the commission in 1931. They chose Apalachin specifically because it was rural, far from sophisticated city investigators who might recognize their faces. Carlo Gambino stepped out of his Cadillac, straightening his expensive suit. Russell Bufalino greeted Santo Traficante. Joseph Bonanno shook hands with Frank De Simone. The most powerful criminal organization in American history was gathering in broad daylight, completely confident that no rural state trooper could possibly threaten them. Sergeant Edgar D. Croswell was nobody's idea of a glamorous detective. At 44, the New York State Trooper worked out of a small barracks in rural Tioga County, patrolling back roads that most federal agents had never heard of. He was a Woodstock native who knew every dirt road, every farm, every family in his territory. The kind of cop that big city mobsters would dismiss as a hick who couldn't find his own handcuffs. But Croswell had something the commission never expected, a memory like a steel trap and the patience of a hunter. 1 year earlier, in September 1956, a routine traffic stop had triggered Croswell's suspicions. A speeding Cadillac on Route 17 near Apalachin. The driver handed over a license, but it wasn't his. The man was actually Carmine Galante, a notorious New York City enforcer with an extensive criminal record. More importantly, Galante had been visiting Joseph Barbara's estate. When Croswell tried to pursue charges, something strange happened. Politicians crawled out of the woodwork. Influential people made calls. Suddenly, everyone wanted Galante's traffic violation to disappear quietly. The pressure to drop the case told Croswell everything he needed to know. Joseph Barber wasn't just a legitimate beverage distributor. He was connected to something much bigger. From that moment, Croswell kept Barber's estate under occasional surveillance. Not constant observation. He didn't have the manpower. But regular check-ins, license plates, visitor patterns, deliveries. November 13th, 1957, 8:30 p.m. Croswell stopped at the Parkway Motel in Vestal to investigate a bounced check complaint, routine police work. At the front desk, he noticed Joseph Barber Jr. reserving multiple rooms, not just a few, dozens. The desk clerk mentioned that Barber had reserved rooms at other hotels across 3 counties. Croswell's instincts fired. Why would Barber need so many rooms? The next morning, November 14th, Croswell drove past Barber's estate. What he saw made him immediately call for backup. Luxury sedans lined the driveway and surrounding roads. Cadillacs, Lincolns, Chrysler Imperials. License plates from New York, New Jersey, Florida, California, Texas, Pennsylvania, Ohio. In a hamlet of 277 people, over 50 luxury vehicles with out-of-state plates had descended on one property. Croswell contacted Trooper Vincent Vasisco and 2 federal treasury agents. He didn't know exactly what was happening at Barber's estate, but he knew it wasn't legitimate. They would set up observation posts, write down license plates, and run them through criminal databases. Inside Barber's mansion, the most powerful crime bosses in America were settling into comfortable chairs, drinking wine, discussing how to divide Albert Anastasia's operations and consolidate Vito Genovese's power. They had no idea that a rural state trooper with a notepad was about to destroy 26 years of carefully maintained secrecy. The mathematics were already against them. 100 mobsters, 4 law enforcement officers, and the mobsters never saw it coming. November 14th, 1957, 12:40 p.m. Inside Barbara's mansion, Vito Genovese was addressing the assembled bosses when someone glanced out the window and saw two uniformed state troopers at the end of the driveway, writing down license plate numbers. The reaction was instantaneous panic. These were men who controlled billions in illegal operations, who ordered murders with a nod, who terrorized entire cities. But the sight of two rural cops with notepads triggered absolute chaos. They weren't afraid of arrest. Most carried minimal cash and had lawyers on retainer. They were terrified of exposure. For 26 years, the commission had operated in complete secrecy. J. Edgar Hoover publicly denied the mafia even existed. Now two hick troopers were documenting everyone's presence at the same location. Someone yelled, "Cops!" and the most powerful crime syndicate in America dissolved into panicked flight. Carlo Gambino, who would become one of the most powerful mob bosses in history, ran into the woods in his $400 suit and leather dress shoes. Santo Traficante from Florida crashed through underbrush. Russell Bufalino from Pennsylvania stumbled through muddy fields. Joseph Bonanno, head of one of New York's 5 families, abandoned all dignity and sprinted for the tree line. It was November in upstate New York. The temperature was barely above freezing. Rain had turned the ground into freezing mud. These men, accustomed to chauffeurs and expensive restaurants, were running through frozen wilderness like hunted animals. Croswell immediately radioed for backup and ordered a roadblock set up on Route 17, the only paved exit from Barbara's estate. It was brilliant tactical thinking. While mobsters crashed through woods, Croswell's small team controlled the choke point. Some made it to their cars and roared down the driveway, only to find state police vehicles blocking the road. Others were caught in the woods by troopers who knew the terrain better than any city gangster. A few were discovered hiding in outbuildings, shivering in their silk suits. By 3 p.m., Croswell had detained 62 men. The list read like a who's who of American organized crime: Carlo Gambino, Joseph Bonanno, Joseph Profaci, Russell Bufalino, Santos Traficante Jr., Vito Genovese. Combined, they controlled crime families from New York to Florida, from Pennsylvania to California, from Ohio to Cuba. When questioned about why they were there, every single one told the same transparently ridiculous story. They had just happened to stop by to visit their sick friend Joe Barber. 62 men from a dozen states and 2 countries all spontaneously decided to visit the same sick friend on the same afternoon. The mathematics told the real story. 4 law enforcement officers, 100 mobsters, and the mobsters were the ones running through frozen woods in terror. The photographs hit newspapers nationwide the next morning. November 15, 1957. Front-page headlines screamed about the Mafia Summit in rural New York. The New York Times published names, criminal records, and home cities of the detained mobsters. America woke up to photographic proof that organized crime operated as a coordinated national conspiracy. For FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, Apalachin was a public humiliation. For years, Hoover had insisted that organized crime was a local problem, that crime syndicates were isolated operations to be handled by local police. He had publicly mocked the idea of a national criminal organization. Now 2 rural state troopers had captured 62 high-ranking mobsters from New York, New Jersey, Florida, California, Ohio, Texas, Pennsylvania, and Cuba, all gathered at a single location. The FBI could no longer pretend the mafia didn't exist. Within days, federal and state investigations launched on an unprecedented scale. The New York State Investigation Commission began interrogating the detained mobsters. Treasury agents examined tax returns. Federal prosecutors convened grand juries. What Edgar Croswell had stumbled upon became the foundation for decades of coordinated anti-mafia operations. In January 1959, 20 of the Apalachin attendees were charged with conspiring to obstruct justice by lying about the nature of the underworld meeting. All were convicted and sentenced to prison terms ranging from 3 to 5 years, with fines up to $10,000 each. Though the convictions were later overturned on appeal, the damage was done. The Commission's greatest asset, secrecy, had been destroyed. The raid exposed the Commission's organizational structure that had operated invisibly since 1931. Investigators now had documented proof of connections between crime families across state lines. They had license plates, names, addresses, and undeniable evidence that these criminals coordinated activities nationally. More devastating than the arrests was what Apalachin revealed about mafia vulnerability. These men who terrorized cities panicked at the sight of 2 state troopers. They abandoned expensive cars, destroyed suits worth hundreds of dollars, and told transparent lies about visiting a sick friend. Their desperation exposed weakness where they had projected invincibility. The psychological impact rippled through law enforcement nationwide. If a rural sergeant with a notepad could expose the commission, what could coordinated federal investigation accomplish? State and federal agencies began realigning resources to focus on organized crime as a national priority. Joseph Barber, the host whose estate was supposed to provide perfect cover, saw his life collapse. He lost his lucrative bottling contract with Canada Dry. He faced federal indictments for tax evasion and refusing to testify before grand juries. On June 17, 1959, just 19 months after the raid, Barbara died of a heart attack at age 52. The meeting meant to crown Vito Genovese as boss of bosses instead destroyed the commission's invisibility and changed American law enforcement forever. What Edgar Croswell had stumbled upon wasn't just a gathering of criminals. He had exposed the existence of the commission, the governing body of the American Mafia that had operated in absolute secrecy since 1931. 26 years earlier, Charles Lucky Luciano had revolutionized organized crime by creating a corporate structure for the underworld. Instead of constant gang wars over territory and power, Luciano established the commission as a board of directors for crime families nationwide. 5 New York families formed the core: Luciano, later Genovese, Gambino, Bonanno, Profaci, and Lucchese, with representation from major cities across America. The commission's purpose was chillingly efficient: settle territorial disputes without bloodshed, approve or deny major assassinations, divide criminal enterprises, and establish policy on narcotics trafficking. Like any corporation, the commission held regular meetings to discuss business. The difference was that their business involved billions in illegal gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and drug trafficking. For over 2 decades, the commission had operated invisibly. Law enforcement knew individual mobsters existed, but the idea of a coordinated national criminal conspiracy seemed like Hollywood fiction. That's exactly what the commission wanted. J. Edgar Hoover publicly denied its existence because he genuinely didn't know it was real. The Apalachin meeting had been called for specific business. Albert Anastasia, boss of what would become the Gambino family, had been murdered in a Manhattan barbershop on October 25, 1957. Vito Genovese had orchestrated the hit as part of his power grab. Now the commission needed to divide Anastasia's lucrative operations and officially recognize Genovese's leadership. They also needed to address the narcotics problem. Some bosses wanted to ban drug trafficking entirely because it brought too much law enforcement attention. Others saw the massive profits and wanted in. The commission would decide policy binding on all families. But Genovese's coronation became his catastrophe. The meeting meant to legitimize his power, instead exposed the entire commission structure to public scrutiny. Newspapers published organizational charts showing how crime families connected. Prosecutors understood for the first time that they weren't fighting isolated gangs but a nationwide corporation. Genovese's regret was profound. Before his death in federal prison in 1969, he remarked that he wished he'd broken both my legs before I accepted that invitation to Apalachin. The exposure triggered a chain reaction. In 1963, Joseph Valachi, a Genovese enforcer who believed his boss had marked him for death, became the first made man to publicly testify about La Cosa Nostra. Valachi confirmed everything Apalachin had suggested: a national organization with formal structure, initiation rituals, and governing rules. What had been dismissed as paranoid conspiracy theory was now documented fact. The commission existed, and one rural state trooper with a notepad had revealed it to the world. 28 years after Edgar Croswell crashed that meeting in rural New York, federal prosecutors finally delivered the knockout blow. On February 25, 1985, U.S. Attorney Rudolph Giuliani stood before cameras and announced indictments against the heads of New York's 5 families: Anthony Fat Tony Salerno of the Genovese family, Carmine Jr. Persico of the Colombo family, Anthony Tony Dux Corallo of the Lucchese family. Represented were the most powerful criminal organization in America. Giuliani called it probably the worst day for the mafia. Time magazine called it the case of cases, and the most significant assault on the infrastructure of organized crime since the high command of the Chicago Mafia was swept away in 1943. The weapon was RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, passed in 1970 but barely used until the 1980s. RICO allowed prosecutors to charge entire criminal enterprises, not just individual crimes. The genius was treating the commission itself as a criminal corporation. Every member could be prosecuted for the enterprise's crimes, even if they personally didn't pull triggers or collect bribes. But RICO wouldn't have been possible without Apalachin. Croswell's raid had provided the first documented evidence that the commission existed. Without those license plates, those photographs, those 62 detained mobsters, prosecutors couldn't have proven a national criminal conspiracy. The commission trial prosecution was overwhelming. 5 years of investigation, 171 court-authorized wiretaps, strategically placed bugs in mobsters' homes and cars, over 200 federal agents involved. The indictment grew from 15 counts to 25, including extortion, labor racketeering, narcotics, gambling, and murder. Most devastating was broken omertà, the mafia's code of silence. Angelo Leonardo, acting boss of the Cleveland family, became the highest-ranking mobster ever to testify. He explained commission structure, membership rules, and decision-making processes to stunned jurors. FBI undercover agent Joseph Pistone, who had infiltrated the Bonanno family as Donnie Brasco, provided insider testimony. The trial lasted from September 1986 to November 1986. On January 13, 1987, 8 defendants were convicted and sentenced to 100 years in federal prison, the maximum under RICO. Salerno received an additional 70-year sentence in a separate trial. Persico got 39 more years. The bosses would die in prison. The commission's power was shattered. The mafia didn't disappear, but it would never again operate with the confidence it had on November 14, 1957, when 100 mobsters gathered at Joe Barbara's estate, believing they were invisible. The chain reaction was clear. Croswell's raid exposed the commission. Exposure enabled investigation. Investigation produced evidence. Evidence enabled RICO prosecution. RICO destroyed the commission. One rural trooper with a notepad had started the dominoes falling 28 years earlier. Edgar D. Croswell died on November 21, 1990, at age 77, of emphysema. He spent his final years quietly in upstate New York, never seeking celebrity despite having changed American law enforcement forever. His obituary in the New York Times was headlined, "Sergeant who upset 57 mob meeting dies." His son, Robert Croswell, became a New York State police lieutenant and patrols the same roads his father once did, working out of the same Delaware County barracks. When Robert looks at old photos showing his father brandishing a gun for Parade magazine in 1959, he chuckles. "If you knew my father, that had to be staged because my father didn't like guns." The mathematics of Apalachin remain staggering. 100 mobsters arrived at Joe Barbara's estate believing they were invisible. 4 law enforcement officers, Croswell, Trooper Vincent Vasisco, and 2 Treasury agents, crashed the most important mafia meeting in history. 62 bosses were detained, including the heads of America's most powerful crime families. Every single one claimed they had just stopped by to visit their sick friend Joe Barbara. The transparent absurdity of 62 men from a dozen states spontaneously visiting the same sick friend exposed not just their presence but their desperation. The cascade of consequences stretched across 3 decades. Apalachin forced J. Edgar Hoover to acknowledge the mafia existed. That acknowledgement triggered federal investigations. Investigations produced evidence. Evidence enabled RICO prosecutions in the 1980s. RICO destroyed the commission. Croswell became an expert witness, testifying before grand juries and congressional hearings. He later joined New York's Organized Crime Task Force. He never became Hollywood's version of a mob-busting hero. He was too professional, too methodical, too focused on the work. But the stones he kicked over that November day in 1957 started an avalanche. His surveillance led to the passage of new state and federal racketeering laws. It led to the breaking of omertà by turncoat informants like Sammy the Bull Gravano. It led to the commission trial that imprisoned the bosses of New York's 5 families for life. The Barbara estate still stands on McFall Road in Apalachin. Locals call it the Mafia House. It sold for $130,000 after Joe Barbara's death in 1959, and for a time was used for sightseeing tours. These days, the wildest things found there are horses. The irony is perfect. Mobsters who controlled billions, who murdered without hesitation, who terrorized entire cities, panicked at the sight of 2 rural cops with notepads. They ran through frozen woods in $500 suits. They abandoned expensive cars. They told transparent lies that fooled no one. They chose Apalachin specifically because they believed rural cops couldn't threaten them. Instead, one rural sergeant destroyed 26 years of commission secrecy and triggered the mafia's eventual collapse. American law enforcement had proven superior to criminal arrogance. Methodical police work defeated organized crime's overconfidence, and it started with Edgar Croswell writing down license plates.